You know, one of the things that our culture breeds is jealousy. Just look at social media, scroll your phone. You're gonna come upon someone's life, someone's possessions, someone's situation, their influence that you are jealous of. Now, jealousy comes from the root of envy. If we're not careful, we leave envy unchecked, it can bring our world down in a hurry. Today, we discuss.
Well, good morning. Hey, thank you guys for being here, whether you're in person or watching with us online. Before we jump into our message, I want to piggyback on something Scott talked about. We're doing a school supply drive for Village Meadows Elementary, just across the street from us. So keep bringing those supplies. We'll be taking one batch over next week, but we'll continue raising as they start the school year. But also, on the back tables, you will see kind of these little signs, and these are little pop-up holders that kind of somehow go like this. But I encourage you, we are actually catering their breakfast for their first day that all teachers report this week. So we're going to put these signs up, and I encourage you just to write a little note before you leave today, just saying thank you for all you do, investing in the next generation, putting up with my little jerk kids if you have kids in elementary school. Whatever that is, we appreciate our teachers. We're so thankful for all they do in our community and want to show that love and support. So anyway, thank you guys again for being here. And today we're continuing on in this series, 7 Things. Now, if you've been with us, this has been kind of like a weighty series. Like, I'm going to be honest, this week I was like, I'm kind of over this, like just yelling about sin each week and saying how terrible we all are. And mostly because as I'm studying this, I'm like, I am a terribly sinful person. Like every week I'm like, I'm not going to struggle with this one. And I'm like, dang it, I'm envious. And last week, we hit on greed, and today we're turning our attention, as we saw in the video, to envy. And envy, when I was like kind of preparing for this, it's almost like the second cousin of greed. They're a little similar here. And then what do I mean like second cousin? Well, they don't know each other that well. They almost never talk. If they're honest, sometimes they don't even like each other. But at the end of the day, they're still related, and they're closer than they want to admit. Now you're like, I don't know if that's a fair representation of second cousins, but do you even know who your second cousin is? That's the real question, because I don't know the difference between second cousin and third cousins, or second cousin twice removed, or something like that. It gets confusing. But you get the point, that like greed and envy are closer related than sometimes we want to admit. Greed, the definition of it, is an intense and selfish desire for something, especially wealth, power, or food. Whereas envy is the desire to have a quality possession or other desirable attribute belonging to someone else. You see, that's the separating factor. Is this idea, is this big difference, is belonging to someone else, is wanting what someone else has. And that's the irony of envy. Is envy despises greed. It hates that people are selfish, that they just take and they hoard and they get more and more, while secretly, deep down inside, it judges them, but deep down inside, it is really just envious. This last week was a dark time in my life. I've been waiting 30 years. Why are we laughing right now? 30 years, I'm a native to Arizona. My whole life, we're 2 wins away from a championship. And when I say we, like I had something to do with it. But I wear my Devin Booker jersey every single game, so I had something to do with it. But 2 games away from winning an NBA championship. And I think like in the course of 2 days, I'm pretty sure like I hit almost all 7 deadly sins. Like, I was angry. I was going to move up the wrath sermon. I was mad. I think we're going to hit gluttony tomorrow. And I'm pretty sure I ate like a lot of Oreos or something like to mask my pain, and ice cream. I was so angry at the Bucks and the refs. I could go on a rant about that because I think we were robbed a little bit. But at the end of the day, deep down, I was really just jealous my team doesn't have a championship. And so often, envy is one of those that just feeds other sins. And here's the humbling truth I want to give you about envy, and we're going to kind of talk and wrestle through this a little bit, that the sin of envy destroys us internally while putting on a show externally. We said in this series that all these sins have the ability to destroy us when they are left unchecked, but they don't all do it the same way. That's the difference, is they can all wreck our world, they can all destroy our relationships, they can all kill us in some way, but they do it differently. And envy does it in one of the most private and internal ways possible. Because often we don't like to talk about envy. Often you don't show envy externally, like you keep it buried deep within. And often we might not even know we are envious and jealous of something else, but it's just brewing beneath the surface. A couple years ago, a couple friend of my wife and I, my wife just came and told me one time, she's like, so-and-so, they got a new car. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. And like, no, their family member gave them a new car. And I'm like, what? And then they're like, yeah, it was like, they just like had this, whatever was circumstance behind it, but they just gave them a car. I'm like, well, that must be nice. She's like, it was really nice. It was brand new. I'm like, that's not what I'm saying. I'm like, yeah, who gets a car? Come on now. And I have another friends, they have friends who get tickets to games. And I'm just like, I was like, I'm annoyed. I'm like, well, I don't know. And I'm going on and my pride's the best of me. I was like, well, I don't need my family member to give me a car. I have my own cars. I buy them. I work for this. And I'm sounded like a grumpy old man, which I am sometimes. And my wife is like, no, it's a good thing. But what I realized as I reflected on that really, I wasn't mad because they were giving something that they didn't work for, they didn't deserve. I was mad because I was like, why don't I have a family member giving me a car? Why don't I get in that situation? Why doesn't this happen to me? And our lives are filled of pointing at things. Why isn't that happening for me? Why is it just happening to that dude on social media or my brother or my sister or fill in the blank, and we can get envious and we can get jealous. Solomon tells us the fear of this in Proverbs 14, verse 30. I want you to listen to this. We're going to put it up on the screen ahead. There's a huge warning here. He says, a heart at peace gives life to the body, but listen to what envy does. Envy rots the bones. Rots the bones. It's an interesting description that Solomon chooses to use here because you see, your bones can rot and still be functional. Your bones can be rotting and you can still be walking around like you don't know something's wrong. But the difference is when a bone is rotted, it's hollowing out. So when enough pressure is applied, instead of that being solid and that withstanding that pressure, it snaps. You see, what Solomon is trying to tell us here is that envy works in the same way. It rots us out internally that often no one else notices. Often we don't even notice it's happening until the pressure is applied. So, why is this so bad? And another way to say is, why does envy destroy us from the inside out? Why does it work this way? Well, James chapter 3, we're going to start in verse 13. James is going to kind of give us a little background on why envy is so destructive, why envy is so hard in our lives. And we're going to be starting James chapter 3, verse 13. Let me read kind of the intro of this, and he's going to give us a little bit of kind of an intro to this section. And this is what James says. He says it this way, that who among you is wise and understanding? By his good conduct, he should show that his works are done in the gentleness that comes from wisdom. Verse 14, but if you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your heart, don't boast and deny the truth. You see, James kind of leads into this little section. He shows that there's a contrast. There's a contrast between the true wisdom and the true truth that comes from God. That's what he introduces in verse 13, who is wise and understanding. This wisdom comes down from God. But then he also says there's also a worldly wisdom that finds its root in envy and selfish ambition. Now it begs the question is why is this so bad? Why is it so bad that this envy leads to this worldly kind of selfish ambition? What does this all mean? Well, he continues, and the first thing he tells us is, how does this destroy us? Why is this so bad? Is first, that it's a tactic of the devil. Check out verse 15. He says, such wisdom does not come down from above, being from God, from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. Earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. James doesn't hold any punches here. He didn't say it's like, it's okay to be a little jealous of others. It's okay to have some envy in you. Like, everyone does it. It's no big deal. Like, it's cool to be jealous. But he said, no. It's earthly. It's unspiritual. It's demonic. And that's a very strong way of saying this is something that is bad. And he says it comes from the bad people. It comes from the devil and his demons. This past season, my kids are getting a little bit older. They're almost 5 and 3 years old. So I'm trying to get them to watch sports. I'm like, you can't just watch like Cocomelon or Octonauts. Like, you got to start watching sports with dad. So mom lets us, every night and weekend. But we're like, anytime a Suns game was on, especially in the playoffs, we're watching it. So I'm trying to get my kids entertained. So I'd have them sit with me, and they'd kind of ask questions. And then I kind of made a mistake here. I would say, those are the good guys, talking about our team, and those are the bad guys. Now, one, kids don't really recognize people, they recognize colors, and the jerseys change every other game, so they're super confused on that. And then they're like, the ones in the black jerseys, the Suns Valley jerseys, they're like, those are the good guys. I'm like, yep. And the ones in the green jerseys, those are the bad guys. And I'm like, yep. And then so the black ones are the good guys, the green are the bad, and then it kind of got confusing. I'm like, okay, we need to start saying, because then every game they'd be so confused. So then I was had to change. I'm like, okay, we need to say our team, we need to say the other team, because they kept on saying boo, bad guys, and it got weird, and I was like, this isn't good to teach them this. But it's easy from a kid's level to sometimes see what is good or what is bad. They want to see and say, hey, that's bad, that's good. And James is telling us here in James chapter 3 that when envy comes into our life, it is nothing that comes from the good side, but something that strictly comes from Satan. And the reason Satan sends that is Satan doesn't have your best interest in mind. He's not like, hey, I want you to enjoy this. It's going to be good to be jealous and envious of other people. It's going to make you happy. He's like, no. It's a tactic to bring you down, to rot your bones, and to ultimately destroy you. Which then leads into this next point where James continues and he tells us that it not only is a tactic of the devil, but it will also always lead to chaos. Check out verse 16. He says, for where there is envy and selfish ambition, there is disorder and every evil practice. You see, Solomon told us it internally rots our bones slowly, but that eventually this leads to a cascading effect that spills out externally. It starts internal and eventually comes to the point where it hurts externally. In James here, he's actually writing to a Christian community. He's writing to a church. So when he says this, he's saying to people who are in community with one another. And the reason why this is so important is James is telling him that if you keep feeding your envy and if you keep feeding your jealousy and you don't address it, then it will become clear to people around you that you are jealous and angry. Okay? If we keep doing it, eventually you can't hide it inside, and externally you're going to show that you're jealous of other people. But then here's the bad part of that. When that happens, it will lead to disorder. The Greek word actually here for disorder can be translated, and it's kind of where we derive our word for a political unrest. So we've seen literally it becomes chaos. It becomes crazy. It becomes rioting. And here's what James is trying to say. When we are jealous and we envy someone else's life or their stuff, that eventually we can't have a relationship with them anymore because it will lead to a break. And you see, the reason is for this is it will cause a rift to happen. Because think of it this way, if you're going to be bitter and annoyed and only have the ability to fake it in front of someone for so long, eventually it's going to blow up and they're going to know that you're envious of their life. And honestly, if you think of this and if you kind of think of okay, where am I jealous in my life? Where am I envious in my life? A lot of times it's not with close friends. Because you can only be jealous of your close friend for so long before you start showing it. And they're like, dude, stop. Or you start being a critical jerk and you start trying to tear them down because you're mad about where they're at because you're down here and you're trying to bring them down to your level. So you can only have a close friendship for so long if it's full of envy and jealousy. And that's what James is saying here is that eventually it becomes this blow-up session. Either you withdraw because you can't stand being around them anymore because you're jealous, or they dude, I don't want to be around you anymore just because you're a jerk. And you're like, well, I guess it kind of solves itself then, right? Like, if we're envious, the people we're envious around, they'll just leave. And then I'll just be friends with people I'm not envious around anymore. So great, problem solved. Well, here's how I think 2021 has changed the game. Is in 2021, I think the new landscape of envy and jealousy is social media. It's changed the game. Because now, we don't just get to be envious of the people we know, we get to envious of the people we think we know. This last week, I was at kids camp and youth camp, and my wife went, and Josh's wife, Kara, so my wife, Sarah and Kara, they were there, and they were talking about something. They were talking about like, oh, this girl's pregnant. I'm like, who is it? And I'm like, I don't know that person. And they're like, oh, it's someone from like The Bachelor. I'm like, oh. And I was like, so not a real person is what I said, right? Like, doesn't really count. And if we're honest, our lives are filled with people that aren't really real people, that we don't truly know. A couple weeks ago, we talked about porn we talked about lust, and the main landscape we're fighting of lust is pornography. And I think with envy, the main landscape we need to fight in the church now is in social media. Because here's how this kind of works, is we're not, instead of being actively critical and jealous of the people we're around, but instead we see these figures that aren't really real, and we are jealous and envious of their life. And honestly, our Facebook, our Instagram, our Twitters, our Snapchat, our TikToks, whatever you want to fill in the blank, are full of people that we truly don't know, that we envy, and we wish we had their lives, their possessions, their influence, whatever else, fill in the blank. And you may be well, I know everyone that I'm friends with on social media. Like, I've met them all in person. But does that still mean you know them? If you are friends with me on social media, I don't post often. It's about sports, church, or I'm tagged in photos of my family with my kids. And the reason I don't usually post about my kids is I let my wife tag me, so then she gets all the likes and comments on hers, so it's love. But anytime you see a picture of my kids, it's adorable. Let's just say it there. But what we show you are the good pictures. They're smiling, they're happy, they're laughing, they're hugging each other. What we don't show you is a picture of my daughter pushing my son trying to bite my daughter, them trying to rip each other's hair out, because we all know that happens, right? And that's what we do on social media. And we used to call this a church face. Now people don't even have to put a church face, they have a social media face, is they put out this idea of who they think they are, that they want people this perception of I have it all together, when deep down it's just a fake lie of what we're putting out there that we want people to be jealous of, we want people to envy, or want people to think we have it all together when we really don't. So we look around us and we're envious and we're jealous of people who aren't even real and don't even have it together like we think they do. So how does this all stop? How do we buck this trend? How do we not fall deeper into either driving people away in relationships because we're jealous of them, or just wishing we had someone else's life that isn't real, that we just see on our phone? Well, I think how we stop the envy from rotting us internally and slowly driving our lives into chaos, I think we need to start and also look at the same place, is how do we change what's inside? And this is the question I want to frame with that, is how do we have internal revival in our lives? Flip over to John chapter 3. And in John chapter 3, we're going to be picking up in verse 22. And in John 3:22, I'm going to kind of read a few verses and give you a little background, because it's going to sound a little bit like an obscure passage for where we're going, but there's kind of a reason we're going this direction. But in John 3, verse 22, I'll start reading, and it starts like this. He says, "After this, Jesus and his disciples went to the Judean countryside, where he spent time with them and baptized. John," this is John the Baptist, verse 23, "he also was baptizing in Aenon near Salem, because there was plenty of water there. People were coming and being baptized since John had not yet been thrown into prison." Verse 25, "There a dispute arose between John's disciples and a Jew about purification. So they came to John and told him, "Rabbi, the one you testified about and the one who was with you across the Jordan is baptizing, and everyone is going to him." Let me give you a little quick time out here and give a little bit of background on this. John the Baptist was a figure. He was actually the older cousin of Jesus by about 6 to 8 months. And he actually started his ministry a little bit before Jesus started his earthly ministry. And John in his ministry, he started to go around and tell people that God is going to do something big, that they need to get ready because the Messiah is coming. And he started baptizing people to signify what this life change that was coming. And that's why we baptize today, of like going down to our old life, being washed away, coming into this new life in Jesus Christ. So John was getting people ready for this. And then in great timing, Jesus started his ministry. And he began to preach and teach to people as well, and he started attracting crowds and disciples. But then started a little bit of confusion. And in this section, we see some confusion here with the followers of John the Baptist. And this confusion kind of almost went into a little bit of envy type of motion, where they looked at Jesus and they're like, he's kind of intruding on our turf. Now think about this for a second. There's a lot of irony here. Because John was telling people to get ready for the Messiah, to get ready for Jesus. Jesus then comes, and John's disciples are like, dude, what the heck? This guy's coming and taking all our people away. John's like, are you listening? What did I been talking about this whole time? We'll get there in a second. But John's disciples are just like, I don't know about this Jesus guy. He's taking our people away. He's taking our influence that we've built. Which leads us to our first step of internal revival in our life, at the same that John shows us here, is we need to be content in God's plan for our life. Let's read John's response in verse 27. I just love this. John chapter 3, starting in verse 27, he says, John responded, "No one can receive anything unless it has been given to him from heaven." He says, "You yourselves can testify that I said," okay? Listen to what he said. "I've already told you this," okay? You wrote it down or something. You know that I've already said this. And this is what he says in verse 28. "I am not the Messiah, but I've been sent ahead of him." You see, John the Baptist was crystal clear. He was like, guys, I told you from the beginning that I'm not the Savior. I am merely a mouthpiece to point to the Savior. John knew exactly what God's plan for his life was. And ultimately, we usually get envious when we forget that we are part of God's plan. We get envious when we're like, man, that guy's got more money than me. That guy's got more stuff than me. Or this person, they have more talents than me. Like, I can't sing or play guitar. I always wanted to be a rock star, and it failed miserably, right? So, like, I wish I could sing like Josh. I wish I could stand there. We get envious of other people's talents, of other people's gifts, and we're like, I wish God could use me in that way. And we forget how God actually has called us to, or what he has actually placed us in. And sometimes what we perceive others' roles to be, what we perceive others' talents to be, God is saying, why don't you focus on what is your job? And I think we need to ask ourselves, do we know what God's plan for our life is? And then, are we content in that plan? You see, contentment's a really hard thing. We mentioned it last week along with generosity, as those kind of contentment and generosity go together to fight greed. But this contentment also allows us to love our current life without longing for someone else's. Last week, I shared with you that one of the things when we first started our church and our ministry, our first few years especially were rough. And I'd constantly been like, man, I want to go back to my corporate job. I want to go back to the business world. I want to go back to this, go make more money. I see where my friends are at. I just want to leave. I want to leave. I want to leave. I want to leave. And God kind of stopped me and called me of like, this is the plan I have for your life. But then he also caused me to reflect. And I was like, man, God's blessed me in ways I don't deserve. I have a family. I have a third kid on the way. I think that's a blessing. We're really excited about it. Our lives are going to blow up, but it's going to be great. But it's like, bless my family, put a roof over our head, put money in the bank so we're not worried about where our food comes from tomorrow. It's like God has blessed me, and it allowed me to reflect and just say, God has put me on this plan. He has provided, and I can be content in it. But you see, often we don't do that because instead we hear the other message from our world. And the lie we buy into, and especially in American culture, is that we always need more. And the reason we buy into this lie is because we are sold it every day, everywhere, wherever we go. One of the things that drives me crazy is if you ever gone to the dealer and bought a car, and we've done that a couple times, we'll buy pre-owned certified, which are way cheaper, but still nice. And so we done that. But the thing that drives me crazy is they keep you on their call list. And they'll call you a couple times a year and they'll be like, hey, you ready to trade in your car? I'm like, are you going to give me a brand new one? And I just trade it in and you give me the brand new one and we're good? And they're like, no, they want to sell me one that's more expensive. And I'm like, bro, I got 100,000 miles on it. I got 120 left. I'm good. Leave me alone. But they keep on trying to tell you hey, don't you want that new model? You got to upgrade. You got to get this. The thing I fall into the trap of is with iPhone, they successfully do that to me every 2 years. And I just can't beat it. But it's our lives, they try to tell us is you need to get bigger, you need to get better, you constantly need to be looking for what this is next. And you need to strive for it. And when that person has a bigger TV than you need to upgrade. When this happens, you need to upgrade. And we're sold this kind of lie around us. Instead of being content where we are and look at the blessings of our life, we're always looking at others and seeing what we could have more of. But you see, we not only need to be content in God's plan, but here comes even the harder part. We need to celebrate God's successes. That's easy. In others. Let's keep reading in verse 29. He says, he who has the bride is the groom, but the groom's friend who stands by and listens for him rejoices greatly at the groom's voice. John's saying, I'm not the center of attention. I'm the best man that nobody cares about. I'm rejoicing, but this is not about me. And then he's saying, so this joy of mine is complete. Listen to verse 30. He must increase, but I must decrease. Now you may be thinking, well, duh. John's talking about Jesus. I can celebrate Jesus more than myself, but celebrating Bob more than myself or Bill down the street with his boat, that's not what I'm going to celebrate that. John was talking about Jesus here, not just everybody else. But here's the deal. When God is working in other people's lives, it's not their success, but it's God's we are celebrating. And we can so easily get blinders in just wanting God to bless us, just wanting God to work through us, to work through our church so that we get the glory. But it's not about us ultimately, but it's about his kingdom. We have said this before. If we pray for revival in our city, in the church a mile or half a mile down the street blows up, then we celebrate even if it means our church closes because the gospel is moving forward. But so often we're I'll celebrate it if I'm part of it. I'll celebrate it if it's me that God is working through. But God's no, time out. It's about seeing my success everywhere, whether we are the instrumental part or that we must decrease so God can increase through someone else. And you see, it's no different when we talk about our individual lives. I told you the story about how our friends got a free car, and I was super happy about it. But what's funny about that story is it wasn't that long after my wife's the cool thing is they had to get a car because they needed to replace one. And they were and soon after that, they had a baby, so they needed a car and a family. But it's also allowed them to then pay off their student loan debt, so they have to then take out more debt to get a car or get something that wouldn't be reliable. And in all, it should be something that I celebrated. And in all, when I saw the bigger picture, it's oh man, God showed up in that situation right when they needed it. And so often we can be envious, we can be jealous, and we can look at other people and it's why is God blessing them? Why is this happening in their life? Why is that not happening to me? But God's time out. I'm showing up in their life, and I'm showing my success to build my kingdom, to bless who I bless, and it doesn't matter. We don't have to be jealous of it because we can be content in what God has already done in our lives. and it allows us to celebrate with those around us. You see, nothing kills envy and selfish ambition like unselfish celebration. So when we see people in our life and awesome stuff happens to them, we celebrate it. And when social media, something great and someone brags about it, we celebrate it, even if it's not real. Or when you look in your life and you see that God is showing up and doing something, even when it's hard, we be satisfied and we celebrate in it. And ultimately, we are able to do this because of what Jesus Christ did for us. In just a minute, we're going to take communion. And here's what I love about communion is we're going to remember the sacrifice that Jesus made for us on the cross. But here's what happened. When Jesus died for us and raised again, he gave us the greatest gift that we could ever receive. Meaning we don't have to be jealous of what other people have because we have the gift and the free salvation of Jesus Christ. And that gift then leads to a life that provides for everything we need. So I'm going to pray now, and in just a minute, we're going to take this communion. But I ask as we do this, as we take this communion, this remembrance of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, that it be the fuel to destroy, to kill the envy and selfish ambition in our lives, so that we can live freely in celebration towards God's kingdom. Let me pray for us this morning.